It doesn't matter if Jaxson Robinson decides to return to college or not. The Kentucky Wildcats, outside of his recruitment, still have a ton of work to do to finish their roster.
You are Locked On Kentucky, your daily podcast on the Kentucky Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's going on, Big Blue Nation? Welcome on into Locked On Kentucky, your daily Kentucky Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Lance Dawe, and on today's episode of Locked On Kentucky, we are going to be talking about Jaxson Robinson and this roster. It doesn't matter whether or not Robinson ends up coming back to college or not. The Wildcats still have some work to do outside of his recruitment. Going to talk about the two prospects that Kentucky is looking at outside of him right now, and which we would rather have if we did get the chance to pick and choose. Also on today's episode, Mark Pope appeared on the Paul Feinbaum show down in Destin as SEC is doing their yearly meeting down there, and he talked a lot about the roster building, how everything has come along, and just how excited he is. I want to kind of dive into some of his thoughts on this roster so far on today's episode as well. Thank you so much for making Locked On Kentucky your first listen every single day. Want to remind everyone out there that we are free and available on all platforms. And if you are watching on YouTube, I would greatly appreciate it if you subscribe to the show. And if you are listening on podcast, I would also appreciate it if you subscribed there as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. Kentucky basketball right now, waiting on Jaxson Robinson to see whether or not he returns to college. I am making the dangerous decision to record this right around the time that Robinson could announce, and I will go ahead and place my bet and say as soon as I hit a stop recording on this podcast, news will probably break about whether or not Robinson is going to stay in the NBA draft or if he is going to withdraw. He has until 11:59 Eastern tonight to make that decision. According to Trilly Donovan, he was going to make that decision as to whether or not he was going to stay in the draft after his workout with the Milwaukee Bucks earlier today. And that announcement has not yet come. I believe I'm going to be checking Twitter quite a bit throughout this episode just to make sure we don't miss out on any exciting news. But as of right now, he has not made an announcement as to whether or not he is going to return. So I want to focus here for a second. As good as Robinson is and as important I believe he would be to this team, and if he does end up coming back to college and if he does end up committing to Kentucky, there are a couple of other prospects right now that Kentucky basketball is looking at that they need to go out and try and secure. Sure, Robinson is going to be very important, but if you miss on him, you surely don't want to miss on guys like Will Riley and Wooga Poplar. In case you've been listening to the show or you've been checking out Kentucky news over the past several weeks, right now Kentucky's top three prospects are Robinson, Wooga, and Will Riley, the five-star small forward in the 2025 recruiting class that could reclassify. Riley is taking a visit here at the beginning of June to Kentucky, and I think it's going to be very important that the Wildcats go ahead and get out ahead of the race and try and secure his commitment quickly. I think there's a very good chance that he could reclassify, and I would love to see him in blue and white. If you've listened to the show, you've heard me rave about this kid, about just how good I believe he is, and if you're talking about a pure scorer that needs to be added to this roster, if Robinson does not end up coming, Kentucky wants to, I think, try and push all their chips out here for Will Riley. And even if Robinson does end up committing, I still think that Riley would be the perfect fit for that 12th scholarship, or excuse me, that 13th scholarship, I should say, at that point for the Wildcats because of his potential. We've talked about it before here on the show. If you need a refresher, 6'8", 180-pound small forward out of Pennsylvania, the Phelps School in Pennsylvania. He is a five-star prospect. According to On3, every other recruiting service has him rated as a four-star. This kid is a pure five-star in my mind. He's the number 16 prospect overall in the country, number 3 small forward, a number 2 player out of the state of Pennsylvania. He is an insane scorer and a very quirky scorer at that. The way that he likes to play is it's really uncharacteristic relative to other players at his position that are as highly ranked as he is. He really does do a ton of damage in the mid-range, loves that area, takes almost 5 threes a game, and is insanely efficient from beyond the arc, and he's almost shooting 50% on threes where he is playing off of the dribble, off balance. It's truly impressive the way that he's able to score the basketball. It's unlike anything that I have ever seen, just in terms of unconventional play. It's definitely a quirky style of play that Will Riley does operate with, but it works. And if the ball goes in the hole and he's got the height and weight to kind of fill out the position, I think that absolutely you should look at him, especially when talking about a team like Mark Pope runs. I think that he would be super, super, super fun to see both in a Kentucky jersey this year and next season if he were able to stay on the roster. He's a great three-point shooter, excellent in the mid-range, really, really crafty when it comes to getting to the rim. He can work through, you can work under you, can work over you. So many different things in his bag. A very, very, very versatile offensive piece. Defensively has a little bit of work to do, but I think that Riley and his upside, I really don't see why you would want to look at many other players that could reclassify here. Just a brief update, by the way, on 3-star Jamie Vinson, who decommitted from Vanderbilt and took a visit to Kentucky. Probably not going to be a marriage there. I believe the two are going to be, both the program and Vinson are going to be looking to try and find different players or different places elsewhere. So I think that a guy like Will Riley, you go all in on here, regardless of whether or not Robinson does end up committing. He right now is my first option. And quite frankly, I would take Will Riley right now over Wooga Poplar. Now, would I be upset with Wooga Poplar? Absolutely not. I would not be upset in the slightest if Kentucky ended up getting Wooga because of just how physical a guard he is. A guard with a ton of experience that definitely had his ups and downs at Miami, but at the end of the day, statistically was a solid player, a very solid player. It's just whether or not Mark Pope would be able to rein in a little bit of that consistency from a guy like Poplar. He would probably play at shooting guard if I had to guess for Kentucky. At least that's where I would put him in this rotation. That's probably where things lie right now. I think Kentucky is really hyper-focused on Will Riley and Jaxson Robinson, and I think Poplar, for ranking them, I think it's third on Kentucky's mind. That's not to say that they aren't recruiting him. In fact, according to KSR, Poplar, who has withdrawn his name from the NBA draft, is supposed to take a trip to Kentucky and Arkansas, but nothing finalized as of today. According to Poplar's father, and according to KSR, Poplar will be visiting Oregon starting next week. So Poplar, you got to get him on campus still, but somebody that I think Kentucky would definitely love to have. If we're ranking them, though, if we're ranking the prospects, I think Jaxson Robinson is your biggest prospect here to go after. I'm going to check Twitter just to make sure that we don't miss anything here about Jaxson Robinson and whether or not he does decide to return to college. Robinson is your first overall prospect. He's somebody that played at Mark Pope, I think has some upside in his final year of college, just statistically, and then what he can bring to the table as a volume scorer. But also, I think that the experience is something that you need to take into consideration. I think Will Riley is second with his insane bag and a high upside as a freshman. You can also get him in here as a sophomore to do incredible things for Mark Pope in year 2. And then Wooga Poplar, I think, would be that one-year prospect that you get that's hard, tough, physical, and can bring you some offense and some three-point shooting as well. So that's where it stands right now for me. If Kentucky does not get Robinson, or even if they do, the Wildcats need to secure at least one of Will Riley or Wooga Poplar. Let's talk here a little bit about the Kentucky roster. Mark Pope had some words to say on Paul Feinbaum earlier today about just how exhilarating this entire process has been. Let's talk a little bit about those words and this roster in just a second. Before I do that, though, I want to tell you guys about our friends over at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today and make every playoff shot count. That is FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, continuing along here on the Wednesday edition of Locked On Kentucky, Lance Dawe hanging out here with you. Again, I appreciate you guys checking out the show today. If you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel or the podcast feed, wherever you are tuned in, I would greatly appreciate it if you went ahead and did so. I want to remind you guys here real quick, if you want to join the Locked On Kentucky Discord, it's free to join. It's just a place for everybody to chat, hang out, talk about Kentucky hoops, football, baseball, anything Kentucky related on your mind. The link to that is over on my Twitter at @LanceDawe_. It's pinned there at the very top in case you want to join the Discord. It's been super fun so far, and we'd love to have you. But again, at @LanceDawe_ on Twitter if you want to go find that. All right, so we've talked about Jaxson Robinson. Even if he does come back, Kentucky's got some work to do with Will Riley and Wooga Poplar. They need to secure at least one of those players to round out this roster, even if they don't get Robinson. Before we kind of dive into this rotation and this roster and kind of how it's come together, let's talk about Mark Pope discussing how it came together. Again, earlier on Paul Feinbaum earlier today, he went on and talked about just how exhilarating this entire process has been. He talked about how it's been really exhilarating because they essentially started with no players on the roster. Mark Pope did, and that's definitely the case. Now, Travis Perry was somebody that you had to try and make sure stayed with the Wildcats, and of course he ended up doing so. But there were essentially zero players when Mark Pope got here, and it was very difficult, I think, in the early going, especially without a staff or even a couple of members to work with him. Now, as time went on, different guys got added to that staff, and all of them collectively, I think, have done a phenomenal job recruiting in the transfer portal, and then also just making themselves known at these different EYBL circuits and going across the country and getting to interact with these kids and already lining up a couple of different visits, getting involved with the Boozer twins, I think is going to be very important down the line. But there was essentially nothing at the beginning, and Mark Pope said it was a lot of fun. He said, "We started essentially with zero players on the roster, which is terrifying at the University of Kentucky, where the only thing acceptable is winning a national championship. It's hard to do that with no players, and it's hard to do that with great players." He said it was a terrifying way to start, but it's also really exhilarating, especially for us. We push the envelope on style of play. We're very, very much pushing a pro style of play, and so it's a little bit unique in style of play in college basketball. Getting to jump into the portal and go handpick guys that fit the way we play exactly and do it from the very beginning has actually been really exhilarating, and we're incredibly excited about the roster we've put together so far, and we can't wait to get them on the court together. I want to emphasize something here, and it's something that Mark Pope emphasized. He's incredibly excited about the roster they've put together so far. He really put an emphasis on what they have done so far, meaning that there is, in fact, work that needs to be done. Again, with Robinson, Poplar, Riley, they are not done yet. But I think that there has been one thing that has consistently remained true about this roster and the building process of it over these last several weeks. Kentucky has essentially been able to handpick guys that fit the system and what they want to do. Obviously, there have been a couple of misses. Jeremy Roach would have been nice. Chaz Lanier would have been huge. No doubt about it. There are a couple of different pieces that Kentucky has not been able to land, but most of the kids that they've interacted with have either committed to the Wildcats or the Wildcats have found somebody else that they have been interested in, and the two have mutually parted ways. That has been an excellent thing that I don't think we've talked about enough over the past couple of seasons. When Kentucky stumbled into the offseason after the shocking loss to St. Peter's and then after the round of 32 exit to Kansas State, Kentucky had some work to do in the portal, and they had some work to do still in the recruiting rankings. And this past season, especially so, the Wildcats really didn't get their roster together until about late July. Everything was not truly there. And then whenever late July got around, Aaron Bradshaw was hurt. Onyenso got hurt before the Global Jam. Kentucky was struggling. Zvonimir Ivicic didn't get on board until August, so I guess you could say Kentucky didn't have a roster until August of last year, and that's 2 months before you're expected to go out there and compete for a national championship. The fact that this staff, the fact that Mark Pope came in here and said, we're going to go out and we're going to try and get guys that fit our system. They were able to do that in such a short amount of time, put together an entire roster, 11 players on scholarship right now, and you're looking to add the 12th and 13th here in the next few weeks. That is incredibly impressive. My hat goes off to Mark Pope and his staff. It has been very, very impressive what they've been able to do in the transfer portal. And I really do hope, the hope for me is that it translates to the high school recruiting rankings next season. Sure, Kentucky's going to be able to get different guys in the transfer portal that I think, frankly, are going to have to, some of them are going to have to replace the seniors that you have on this year's roster. However, I also think guys like Trent Noah, Travis Perry, Jasper Johnson, Will Riley, guys that are younger, I think you're going to have to try and dip into these high school rankings consistently and pull out talent that stays with you for a little bit. I've continued to talk about how well UConn has executed on this, where they have been able to go get guys that were really highly ranked recruiting prospects, I should say, and they're able to keep them on roster for 1, 2, maybe even 3 seasons while also pairing them with some really talented transfer portal players that fit what they want to do. Pope, I think, is going about building the roster, at least for year 1, perfectly. There is hardly anything that I would change about this. There's hardly anything Kentucky could really do to change this other than land Jaxson Robinson and Will Riley. I think they're the 2 top priorities here at the very end of the day. But so far, yeah, it's been exhilarating. This was an incredible month of May for the Kentucky Wildcats, an incredible month of May here for us here at Locked On Kentucky, but super, super fun to get to talk about just how well this team has been constructed. And I think from the top down, a couple of more pieces, and Kentucky is going to be set. Now, let's turn our attention to the roster. Right now, you have 11 players on scholarship. Lamont Butler, Kerr Carissa, Travis Perry, Colin Chandler, Kobe Brea, Otega Owe, Trent Noah, Andrew Carr, Ainsley Almanor, Brandon Garrison, Amari Williams. That is essentially 2 players at each position, minus point guard, where you have, I think, 3 players that fit that role very, very well. Kentucky, if they are able to get Robinson and Riley, I think it's going to be an interesting conversation for us to have this offseason about this rotation, about the depth of this team, and who kind of gets left out when it comes to minutes, because you're looking, again, up and down this roster. Butler is going to get playing time. Kerr Carissa is going to get playing time. Kobe Brea is going to get playing time, as is Otega Owe. Andrew Carr is going to get playing time at power forward. Amari Williams and Brandon Garrison, I think, are going to be very important at the center position. Travis Perry, Colin Chandler, Trent Noah, Ainsley Almanor are the 4 guys right now that I look at and say, I like things about them individually. I like the way that they play the game, but you really do have some seniors here that are going to expect to contribute. And it's going to be, again, just a fascinating conversation as to how Kentucky wants to kind of structure this rotation, especially once they bring, if they bring Jaxson Robinson on, or if they bring a guy like Will Riley on. Because then you have to have the conversation about, okay, you've got 1, 2, 3 different freshmen coming in here alongside a guy like Will Riley. Where do those 4 fit in, and does Riley end up taking somebody's spot that normally would have gotten a little bit of playing time in their freshman season? I'm not quite sure how Kentucky's going to manage that, because from top to bottom, let's even say Kentucky gets Poplar and Riley. You've got guys in Brea, in Owe, that are going to expect to play. They are going to expect to play, and you pair Poplar in that situation where you've got a really weird dynamic going on between your 2 and your 3. Heck, even Robinson. If you get Robinson and Riley, you've got some questions to answer as to who gets that time. It's going to be a very fun figuring it out period, I think, in September and October as to how Kentucky's kind of going to construct this. They've got 2 guys that could start at point. Right now, I think they've technically got 3 different guys that could start at shooting guard if you want to hype up Colin Chandler. And frankly, I'll just go ahead and say this. If Kentucky does not get Jaxson Robinson, period, and they end up just getting Will Riley, it's Colin Chandler's time. It's his time to shine, because I think I would rather have Brea at the 3, or in a different world, you have Otega starting at the 3, you have Brea backing him up, and you have Chandler starting at the 2, and then Perry backing him up, or Kerr Carissa backing him up. I really do think Colin Chandler could develop into something really special. I'm getting more and more excited about him the more that I watch and I read about him. I really am talking myself into him having an important role, maybe not, if it's not this season, at some point in the blue and white for the Kentucky Wildcats. All of that to say, you really start to get into a logjam here in terms of talent, because all of these guys produced in the transfer portal. Butler led a team to a national championship berth. Kerr Carissa is the starting point guard on a really, really good Arizona team and a decent West Virginia team. Kobe Brea was statistically the most efficient shooter in all of college basketball. Andrew Carr, starting power forward for the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. Amari Williams, 3-time conference DPOI. Brandon Garrison, really, really good in his own right at Oklahoma State, starting as a freshman, McDonald's All-American. Otega Owe, really solid two-way player that started for Oklahoma and will contribute on both ends of the floor for Kentucky. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to try and feed all of these different mouths. And honestly, I think right now, that's a very good thing. That's a very good thing that Kentucky has that problem. And we're still talking about adding more players. We're still talking about getting to that 13th scholarship potentially. So Mark Pope has had an exhilarating month of May, and I could not be more thrilled with the job that he has done. So let me know what you think in the comments below about Jaxson Robinson, about Mark Pope, about this entire roster. You can also hit me on Twitter at @LanceDawe_. All right. That's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Kentucky. You can follow the show on Twitter at LockedOnUK. You can follow me on Twitter at @LanceDawe_. You can also follow the show over on Instagram at Kentucky Podcast. Any questions, comments, concerns, leave those in the YouTube comments below. Hit me on the socials. I will see you all tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Kentucky. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and God bless.